All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Janice, for getting this rolling here, and thanks to Jeff for joining us for the Weed Management in Corn 2022 webinar here coming up. So I'd like to introduce Jeff Miller. Jeff Miller is an extension educator in Oneida County. He's received a BS degree in agronomy from Delaware's Valley College and an MS degree in agronomy from Penn State University. Jeff's worked for the past 35 years as an extension agronomy educator in central New York, 7 years as a multi-county ag team, and 17 years as the ag team leader in Oneida County. So as Janice said, I think the housekeeping is okay with the chat. We're going to remember that at the end, we have to sign out again. So you're going to repeat that process again in the chat box at the end to confirm attendance for those desiring to get their New York State DEC pesticide credits. So I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Mike. Hope everybody's well, and I hope you're enjoying this series on different weed topics, and hope you attend the future events as well. Yes, today we're going to concentrate on weed management in corn, an integrated approach. And I want to thank both Janice Degny and Mike Hunter for their assistance with today's program and for their collaboration and for the future events that they're going to host and manage. So a good weed management program always starts with knowing the weeds in your fields. It really doesn't matter how you do it. I will say that in the fall, when you're harvesting, is a reasonable time to see all of the facets of the weeds that are in the field, right up to, their heads and flowers, etc. So that's a really good time to look at the full plant to do a better job of identification. And then a modifier that says in field 1, my main problems are nutsedge, crabgrass, and triazine resistant lamb's quarter. And just so that you have that information in the winter time so that you can sit down and pour through your resources and come up with a grouping of herbicides that might be effective against those particular weeds and any other cultural methodologies that you may want to use to control those particular weeds. So we're going to go really quickly through some identification. Here you look at lamb's quarter in upper left, and you see that they have egg-shaped to triangular-shaped leaves with some serrations in the margins. The leaves are alternating up the stem, and you see this kind of mealy white soot that's on the leaves. That's characteristic of lamb's quarter. On the bottom right, we have velvet leaf, and you can see the heart-shaped leaves. It actually has heart-shaped cotyledons as well. And it also has leaves arranged alternately on the stem. Also has definitely fine hairs on it, and that's why some people call it nature's toilet paper. In the upper left, you see common ragweed, deeply cleft leaves, alternate arrangement of those leaves. On the bottom right, you have red root pigweed, and also alternate arrangement of leaves. You have ovate-shaped wavy margins and narrow cotyledons. And red root pigweed, hairs on the stem. We're going to remember that a little bit later. In the upper left, you see field bindweed. Field bindweed has kind of a trailing habit, a vine-like. It has spear-shaped leaves that are blunt at the tip and parallel sides. On the bottom right, you have horse nettle. And if you look at the complete outer margin of the leaf, it's more egg-shaped. But obviously, there's serrations in the margin of the leaf. And I'm just going to show you a little bit closer. You can definitely see the spine-like structures that makes it a nettle. In the upper left, you see hemp dogbane, opposite arrangement of leaves, ovate-shaped leaves with that white vein right down the center, red stem, and then you'll notice that hemp dogbane kind of branches at the top of the plant. That's kind of unique to hemp dogbane versus milkweed, bottom right here. which is a single stem, similar shaped leaves, maybe a little bit bigger, maybe lighter in color, definitely that mid vein there, and definitely opposite arrangement of the leaves. Now on the upper left, you see giant foxtail, definitely the bigger heads compared to the green foxtail and yellow foxtail. If you look at this picture here, you'll see that the ligule is a row of hairs. So that's a distinguishing factor, and there's no auricles. And there are hairs on the upper part of the leaf. Helps distinguish it from its partners, both yellow foxtail and green foxtail. On the right here, we have Barnard Grass, and this is a clean grass. No auricles, appendages coming from the bottom end of the leaf across the stem, no ligule. So this is one that's pretty easy to identify in the field. In the upper left, you have witchgrass. And witchgrass, if you look at where that leaf meets the stem, there's no clasping auricles on it. If you could see the ligule, it'd be a row of hairs, similar to what we just saw. If you look at it in the field late in the season, you see this panicle type seed head. On the bottom right, we have fall panicum. And so similar seed head, the differences are, again, no auricles, fringe of hairs for ligules, but you have this 45-degree angle on the stem. That's kind of unique. And you have hairs on the underside of the leaves only, not hairy all over like witchgrass. On the upper left, we have yellow nutsedge. If you were to take a cross section across that stem and look at it, you'd see a triangular stem. If you took the time to dig the plant out, you would see these tubers down below. On the bottom right, we have crackgrass. And if you look at where the leaf attaches to the stem, this is what a clasping auricle looks like, an appendage of the leaf that crosses in front of the stem. In addition, if you dug out this crackgrass plant, you'd see these white, fleshy rhizomes. So we're going to move into some recently identified herbicide-resistant weeds. Mike and I were talking earlier, and in the late 80s, early 90s, we had our first real resistance that we noted, and that was triazine resistance in lamb's quarter and pigweed. And we solved that with some chemistry changes and adding Prowl to the mix, which took care of those two particular weeds. Now we're starting to see more weeds with resistance, and that's really going to be what we're focusing on today. So here you see a small section of the pigweed family. What you usually see in your fields is red root pigweed, maybe smooth pigweed. These particular plants have ovate shaped leaves. And remember, we talked about having hairs on their stems. You look at the heads late in the season, you see these smaller heads, smaller clumps of seeds. If we move over to water hemp, and we did have water hemp in the, I guess it's the eastern portion of our county on one farm, brought in with some cottonseed, and it was glyphosate resistant water hemp. And so water hemp has both male and female plants. That's one distinguishing factor. The leaves are smaller than red root pigweed, smooth pigweed, and the stems do not have hairs. If you look at palmer, and I hope we never see palmer in our area, hopefully we can avoid that, but palmer amaranth, definitely much bigger seed heads. If you see it later in the season, you'll see these longer seed heads. Again, no hairs on the stem. And I'm just going to bring this up as far as this is red root pigweed, but I wanted to show you, here's the leaf and the petiole. And if you're looking at palmer, the petiole would be longer than the leaf. So that's a unique characteristic that can help you to identify it. But again, hopefully we'll avoid seeing this in our area. I will say the farmer that had water hemp on their farm, one of the problems with these pigweed plants is they produce hundreds of thousands of seed per plant. So you can really develop a lot of weeds from one plant. And if they're all glyphosate resistant, you could have a struggle on your hands. And this particular farmer saw it first in soybeans. He grew a second year of soybeans, collaborated with us on a study, and he used Cobra to try to control it, which it did much better than not having the Cobra. But he did a lot of hand roguing of these weeds. I mean, he did a lot of work to get rid of these weeds. And the following year, he grew corn and used some chemistry that was pretty effective against that particular weed species. And then he went to hay. And, that's something that we're going to talk about in the future here. Mare's tail is something that I'm definitely seeing in our county, and I think people are seeing this all over New York State now. If you picture soybean producers, even from the early 90s when Roundup was really being released and Roundup Ready varieties were becoming available, it was a program that really took off. A lot of farmers, when they were growing soybeans, used Roundup and Roundup alone. And that has continued in a lot of fields. And you can picture using the same product year after year after year in the production of those soybeans, that if a weed escapes because it is resistant, it's going to produce seed, and that seed is going to produce resistant plants. So that's how we develop resistance, or at least one way we develop resistance. Mare's tail is mainly a winter annual. So what you usually see is this rosette in your fields towards the end of the season. And then the next spring it bolts, growing vegetatively very quickly, produces flowers and then seeds. And one of the unique things about this plant has the same methodology as dandelion. Those seeds have some feathers to them, and they can be picked up by wind and transported. And that's the thing that indicates to some farmers that that's a problem that they're going to see in the future. If you look at this graph, it shows that there are more than 50 plants that have not just resistance to one chemical family, one group, but two groups. 20 that have resistance to three groups, and something around 12 that have resistance to four groups. When you start seeing that level of resistance, it's going to be a short period of time when no chemistry is going to work on that particular set of weeds. I should mention metabolic resistance. This is the plant's ability to actually metabolize an herbicide. So break it down into subparts that are not toxic to the plant, that don't have an effect. And sometimes a plant that's not even exposed to a group can develop metabolic resistance to a group that's never been used on the farm. So yes, we're talking about herbicide resistance and it increasing, and it's going to be a significant part of your crop production in the future. So we have to use every method that we possibly can, every tool in the toolbox related to controlling those weeds. And we start with best management practices. And most people are already doing this. They're doing their research. They're picking hybrids that are suitable to the environment, to their location, to their altitude, to their season length. They're planting at appropriate populations. They're taking soil samples and fertilizing so that there's no shortage of nutrients for those crops. So they're making that crop as competitive as possible to, in effect, grow a great crop, but in the same process, that healthy crop is going to be competitive against weeds. And that's one significant method of doing weed control. Crop rotation, we're going to talk about, tillage, cover crops used to manage weeds, weed seed management, and this is something that we're going to hear about a lot more in the last talk of this series. I'll talk to you about rotating herbicide modes of action, and at times using herbicide combinations with multiple modes of action, especially where you see resistance. So we'll start with crop rotation, and a lot of dairy farmers in my area have a rotation of 3 years of consecutive corn followed by hay. And if you look at this, you have a summer annual row crop. So you're planting it in early May. You've got really no plants really there until, a week or two. And then by mid-June, late June, you're starting to see canopy closure. All of that time is available for those weed seeds to germinate. They got plenty of light, they got plenty of moisture, and plenty of nutrients. So summer annuals, those weeds with the same life cycle as this crop plant are going to be very successful at trying to compete with that crop plant. So going to be very important for us to manage those weeds in the seasons that we have corn. Well, now we plant a perennial crop after 3 years of corn, and that perennial crop gets established. It's competing directly with any kind of weeds, maybe you see some annual weeds in some open spaces, but then you're harvesting this, you're cutting it 3 and 4 times a year. What do you think that does to the annual population? Really a decent control method. If you look at grain producers, then they're doing row crop after row crop, and they're doing a corn soil rotation. At least what you're doing there is you're switching from a grass to a broadleaf weed, and there's different herbicides available for control in those 2 crops. And in rotating to that crop, you're gaining some way to control those particular weeds. The same thing, some people grow winter wheat, and that's a winter annual. You have a completely different set of weeds that will vie with the winter annuals, and you might be able to control some of the summer annuals by growing that winter annual. Tillage, your parents, your grandparents used tillage to uproot perennial weeds very successfully, helping to control those weeds during row crop production. There's always pros and cons. So, with tillage, you're bringing up some weed seeds from down below, bringing them to the surface. So you're generating some new viable seeds near the surface where they can germinate. But in the process of tillage, you're definitely uprooting those perennials and helping to control the perennials. We're definitely seeing a shift. More acres are going in no-till without tillage. And this also has pros and cons. The pros, yes, we talk about all the soil health issues, and they're really important. But in doing no-till, if you have a really good program and you're controlling annual weeds in the row crop, maybe through 2 applications, a burn down and then an in-season application of an herbicide, and you select it properly and you get good control, you are depleting this weed seed bank if you're not tilling it, right? So the seeds that are near the surface are the ones that are going to germinate. And you can, over time, create what they call a stale seed bed. So less viable seeds for those weeds to grow. But the con side of it is, without tillage, you have more variation in weeds. So you might start to see some biennials creeping in and some perennial weeds, and you're going to have to deal with them. I'll mention row cultivators and cultivation. We don't see that an awful lot in field crop production. Obviously, in organic field crop production, is going to be like the paramount tool that they use in weed management. And they're going to have several different cultivators with the intent during the time that they're used of uprooting those weed seedlings and pushing some soil to the row spacing to cover the seedlings in between the plants. And obviously they've made some real significant advances. You see a camera mounted on this cultivator that's helping to guide it and help it to be safer and in that row crop field. And Lynn Sosnowski is going to really spend some time with you on this. So I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time, but weed seed management is going to be one of the things that you're going to be doing in the future. And this is just a picture of a unit that can be attached to a combine, and the chaff and the weed seeds can be funneled into this unit. It's a mill. It'll crush everything. The seeds will not be viable, and you'll be reducing the amount of seeds that are in the fields. So cover crops. Grain producers grow full season crops and harvest, soybeans in October and corn into November at times. The only choice that they have as far as a cover crop is winter rye at that point. It's the only thing that, can grow under those conditions. And will put on any growth before it's put to sleep for winter. We do have some wheat growers in the area, so we do have some bin run winter wheat, but that has to go in earlier than the winter rye. And then we have some dairy farmers that harvest corn silage. So that's, mid-September. We definitely had some drought years where people planted triticale after they harvest corn silage. And that was with the intent of harvesting as forage the next spring in the middle of May. And that was very successful. For those people that are wheat producers and they're harvesting in July, there's definitely more opportunities to cover crops. All what we mentioned, plus the possibility of red clover establishment after harvest. We have a lot of growers that frost crack seed red clover into wheat in the spring. But people that have some issues with crusting have tried tillage radish as well. Not many people in my area use sorghum as a cover crop. It's more of an emergency forage. But those people who have low organic matter levels and are in a row crop situation could consider growing sorghum to increase the carbon content and organic matter. But really what we're talking about is cover crops used for weed control. I asked the question, what affects the success of cover crops on weed control? It's all of these things. Biomass is key. If you have 2 to 3 tons of biomass or more per acre, that means that you've got enough plant material that's going to compete with those weeds, shadow them, so cut off the light, take up the moisture and the nutrients. And that's what you want if you want weed control, is biomass. Cover crops, species selection, and time of planting kind of go hand in hand. We already talked about when people can grow what species just before, like if you're doing a corn silage harvest, you got a little bit bigger window. You can grow winter wheat, you can grow rye. Maybe you can do a radish, if it's early September, but they go hand in hand. Rate of seeding, those people that grow wheat know if you're planting in September, it's one rate. If you're planting in October or early November, it's a much higher seeding rate. You need more plants per acre. Method of seeding, yes, we don't have access to aerial applicators, dropping seed at the yellow leaf stage in soybeans, but we know that the distribution is not that good. The soil seed contact is not very good. So drilling is definitely the ultimate way to incorporate that seed, get good soil seed content and a lot of plant material. Rainfall is a very important part of cover crops. You can either look like you're the king or that you've got a real bad problem. I work with someone, we're going to do a cover crop and intercrop into established corn. We were doing it in June and we had 3 weeks without rain and we did have no cover crop whatsoever. Herbicides are going to be one very important part of this, series of techniques used to control weeds. One of the tools in the toolbox. So what are some of the characteristics that we should be considering when choosing herbicides? First and foremost, that they're effective against the weeds that we've identified in the fields. Price is going to be a big thing this season, right? You're hearing rumblings of things like Roundup going to twice the cost that it was or maybe higher, and some other products the same. You want to know whether they're selective or not selective. Roundup being non-selective, Liberty, and then those selective products like Banville, Dual, etc. You want to know whether they are taken up by plants and move into the plants where they have their effect, or whether they're just contact herbicides. So whatever you spray, whatever your contact is affected, but nothing else beyond that. You want to know whether they're pre-plant incorporated, pre-emergence, early post or late post timing, crop tolerance, compatibility with other herbicides and adjuvants. You want to know if they have residual activity. You want to know if there are restrictions to rotation crops. You really do want to learn mode of action. That's going to be really important in managing resistant weeds. Obviously, you want to know the toxicity for your own safety, as well as the safety of others. You want to know if there's environmental hazards related to the pesticides that you're looking at. Water solubility tells you, okay, if I've got this much rainfall, it's activated. If I don't, it's not activated. Maybe I have to do something else, or at least be aware that I might have to do a rescue treatment. And adsorption relates to the soil applied materials and how much are tied up by the soil and not available for plant uptake. So not available for those weeds to take up and be controlled. So this table was taken right out of Cornell Guide, the 2022 version. And it shows the effectiveness of a series of products against annual broadleaf weeds. And it's just this last list of weeds. So wild buckwheat, common lamb's quarter, wild mustard, red root pigweed, common ragweed, and velvet leaf. And it shows a product that's labeled for pre-plant incorporation and a series of products that can be applied pre-emergence that are labeled for use in corn production. And you can see these annual broadleaf weeds that there are some poor choices. You look at dual and you look across and you say, wow, doesn't really control many of these weeds. Harness, yeah, not so much. Outlook, no, not a good choice. Prowl, again, so there are some products that are really good choices. Atrazine, Callisto is a good choice. Princep is a good choice. Sharpen, good choice. So there's products that can be used. I'm going to focus now on atrazine and simazine. And you saw that they are pretty good against the weeds here in this table. And their group 5 herbicides, they affect their photosynthetic inhibitors. So group 5 photosynthetic inhibitors, atrazine, Princep, and Mike's probably going to talk to you about Sencor next week. So they're taken up by the shoots and roots of germinating weed seedlings. They're systemic, so they are taken up by the plants. They can only move upward in the xylem of plants. They're selective, mostly broadleaf weeds, but some grasses, and they're very messy how they work. Yes, primarily they're affecting photosynthetics. They're inhibitors, they're inhibiting photosynthesis. So they're affecting energy production, but they also produce these reactive molecules that just like cause mayhem within the plant. And it's probably because of how complicated this situation is that we really didn't see resistance to this class of herbicides for a long, long time. Now I want to talk to you about Callisto, and you can see that it's pretty good on most of the weeds, right? Not so much on wild buckwheat, not so much on common ragweed. So Callisto is a group 27, an HPBD inhibitor, a bleacher. And if you look at other products that are in that class, you have Balanced Flex, you have Impact, you have Callisto, you have Lautus. So how do these work? They're taken up by the leaves, roots, and shoots. They're systemic, so they move into the plant. They're transported to the growing points where they inhibit pigmentation, bleachers. Mostly broadleaf activity. Some family members have some activity on some grasses. Most of these are applied early posts, but they have some residual activity. Now we look at Sharpen, okay? And it's got a good rating across the board. So Sharpen is a group 14, which is the cell membrane disruptors. You can picture that plants are all made from those smaller parts, which are the cells, and you can picture if you got something that's breaking up the membranes around the cells, what it's going to do to those weeds. So if we look at the cell membrane disruptors, you look at products like Ultra Blazer, Flexor, Cobra, I mentioned earlier, Resource, Valor, Spartan, AIM, Sharpen, all part of those group 14 cell membrane disruptors. They're predominantly foliar applied herbicides. So the majority of these are applied to the foliage and taken up by the foliage. Mainly contact herbicides. So that means that you have to have good coverage to control those annual weeds, right? Their selective broadleaf weed control, and Sharpen is different than the rest of this group. Sharpen is being applied pre-emergence. So it's moving in the plant So it's a little bit of systemic activity, right? For it to actually work as a pre-emergence. So kind of unique in this family. I definitely have to mention gramoxone. It is a cell membrane disruptor, kind of different family, but anybody that's used gramoxone, you know, okay, you make an application, it's a contact herbicide, you apply it in the morning, by afternoon, the plants are turning yellow. So now we we look at herbicide efficacy on annual broadleaf weeds in summary, and we say, okay, we have 4 different products that we can choose to control pretty much this list of annual broadleaf weeds. So we got some choices, and we have 3 modes of action. The group 5, yellow, those are the photosynthetic inhibitors. The group 27, right here, Callisto, the bleacher, and the group 14, the cell membrane disruptor. So you can picture growing your 3 years of consecutive corn that maybe you use a trizine the first year, the second year, maybe switch to sharpen, different chemistry, different family, and maybe third year, if you're not comfortable with Callisto alone, maybe you combine it with atrazine. And so now you've used multiple modes of action over 3 years to control those weeds, and you're less likely to have any kind of buildup of resistance. We're going to move now, same weeds, but we're going to look at products that are labeled for use in corn post-emergence. So if you look at this list, again, you know, you can see those things that are really effective, that are broad spectrum across the board, controlling this group of broadleaf weeds. And if you look at it, you have dicamba containing products, Banville, Clarity, Diflex. Status has dicamba and another growth regulator. Yukon has permit and dicamba, and each one of them are really good choices as far as post-emergence annual broadleaf weed control. And if you look at this, they're group 4 growth regulators. So group 4, dicamba, right? Then you also have 2,4-D and all of the names of the 2,4-D products that are out there. You also have clopyralid, which is the active ingredient in stinger. So growth regulators, they're selective against broadleaf weeds. They're taken up by the foliage as well as by the roots. They have residual activity. They're systemic. They can act at multiple sites. So definitely, you know, kind of that helter-skelter thing again for this group, like the photosynthetic inhibitors. They move both in the xylem and the phloem. And I think because of that, they can control both annuals and perennials. So group 4 growth regulators. Now we move on to Callisto, Caprino, Impact, Loudus, and Shield X. And you look again, they hit quite a few of these annual broadleaf weeds and do a very good job. So good second choice. And you see that group 20, they're group 27 HPPD inhibitors. They're bleachers, okay? They're taken up by the leaves, roots, and shoots. They're systemic. They're transported to the growing points where they inhibit pigmentation, mostly active on broadleaf plants. Some family members act on grasses. Again, applied early post, most of them, and they have some residual activity. And if you look at Callisto as a trione, Impacts, okay, Loudus, and combinations of them with other products. And a lot of people are familiar with Acuron, and you have 2 HPPD inhibitors, the bleachers, combined with a group 15 and a group 5. And that's really what we're talking about, is combining different modes of action so that if one fails, the other one picks up the slack and kills that weed, so you don't have resistance buildup. Now I'm going to talk to you about Accent Q, Permit, Resolve Q, and Steadfast Q. And here you're starting to look at I'm going to say selective broadleaf weed control, meaning not as broad spectrum. So you see a lot of these weeds are not controlled by these products. So you have to know what weeds you have in your field and look at these to select which ones you might want to use. These are group 2 ALS inhibitors, and this is that acetolactate synthase inhibitor. You see some of the products: Permit, Accent Q, Resolve, and Steadfast is a combination of Resolve and Accent. So the thing that's unique about these ALS inhibitors is they work on one key enzyme in a pathway that produces amino acids. Well, one key enzyme, one spot in the plant, not like Banville, which is creating havoc across the entire plant, or atrazine and Princep, which are doing the same. This is one key enzyme. So you can picture those weeds, one escaping and producing seed of a whole bunch of plants that now are resistant to this particular effect of affecting one key enzyme. So that's caused some problems. This group has a lot of weeds that are resistant to it. Still effective in this area. This is something that we'll continue to look at, and Lindsay Snosky might talk to you a little bit more about that. So we're moving along to aim and resource. And again, look at this list. Resource is pretty much used to control velvet leaf. And yeah, if you have velvet leaf that's out of control, it's very tall, resource can take it down. So it has its place if you have that problem. But you look at them and you have to know which weeds you have to successfully pick one or the other. They're group 14 herbicides. They're cell membrane disruptors. Okay, here they are: resource and aim. We'll also remember sharpen from the discussion before. But resource and aim, foliar applied herbicides, mainly contact. So what you hit is control, what you miss, you're not controlling. So that's a pretty important factor when you're applying these products. Selective broadleaf weed control. And sharpen obviously has residual activity. Now we're moving on to Bazaran and Buckdrill. And again, okay, they control some of these annual broadleaf weeds, but not very many of them. These are group 6 herbicides. They are photosynthetic inhibitors, just like we talked about before with the group 5, the atrazine and Princep. But this group is very different, okay? Group 6, they're taken up by foliage only. These are taken up by the roots and shoots. These are contact herbicides. They can cause temporary burning in crop foliage, and you definitely have to read the label really good to make sure that you're not moving into an environment where they can actually hurt the crop. So this is a summary of your post-emergence materials and their control of annual broadleaf weeds. You got 17 different products. You have 6 different modes of action. I'm going to say your strongest are going to be the yellow arrows. Anything that has dicamba in it is going to provide some significant broad spectrum control for these annual broadleaf weeds. This group, the Callisto, Cuprino, Impact, Loyaltis, and Shieldex, group 27, the bleachers, they too control a much broader spectrum of these weeds. We didn't talk about the group 5, atrazine oil. This is something that, I haven't heard people doing this in quite some time, but it is effective. I think what happened was they limited the number of total pounds they can use in a year and the latest that you can use it. So it kind of fell out of vogue. But then you start moving into the ALS inhibitors and photosynthetic inhibitors in group 6 and the membrane disruptors, very selective on specific weeds. You really have to know what weeds you have to select any one of those in combination, maybe with something else to provide control. But you got 6 modes of action. So that does give you a lot of room to switch gears, use a different mode from year to year, or combine different modes in a single application. So now we're going to talk about annual broadleaf weed control from non-selective post-emergence herbicides. First one is Liberty. It's a group 10. Glufosinate is the active ingredient. Liberty can be used as a burn down prior to corn planting. It can be used in season as an early post-emergence, underline early, for application in glufosinate tolerant corn hybrids. You definitely have to hit them early if you're going to get control. Liberty is non-selective, but it's a contact herbicide, really only effective against annuals. Should be applied actively to actively growing weeds and like 3 inches to 1 inch height. Roundup is another choice. Glyphosate's the active ingredient, is non-selective, yes, but it's a systemic. So it will have an effect on not only annuals, but perennials, biennials. Used as a burn down prior to planting, similarly, or in glyphosate tolerant corn. So we've talked about annual weed control up to this point. Now we're talking about perennial broadleaf weed control. So 2,4-D and Banville, dicamba, applied with pre-emergence application will control most broadleaf perennial seedlings. So there's a lot of people that have a program and they add a couple ounces of 2,4-D or Banville, and that's very helpful in controlling those perennial seedlings. 2,4-D or Banville should be applied as close as possible to bud stage of established broadleaf perennials. So this is not an easy thing to do. We have row closure, we have poor application. So this is just something that you have to do the best that you can. But the closer it is, the later it is in the season, the more likely you're going to get control using those products on those established broadleaf perennials. Roundup is definitely one of those products that can be used. I don't see people using them at the seedling stage, but I definitely see people holding on and putting the application of glyphosate in late to those perennial broadleaf weeds and having pretty good control. So we're moving from broadleaf weeds now to annual grasses. These are the annual grasses that Russ studied, and he made personal ratings of the control achieved by these products on these grasses in his field studies. So he looked at Barnard Grass, large crabgrass, foxtails, full panicum, and witchgrass. And right away, your eye goes to those materials that were not good for broadleaf weeds, but they're excellent for grasses. So dual harness outlook, Prowl, just excellent, right? Princep, maybe a drop down in control level. And that's right away. Red dots are those products that are kind of excellent across the board for all of these grasses, and yellow because Princep is rated just a little bit lower in its control of these grasses. So we're first going to concentrate on dual harness and outlook. Again, excellent control. They're group 15 seedling shoot growth inhibitors. That should definitely tell you a timing. Seedling shoot growth. So group 15, if you look at this subgroup, the chlorosetamides, that's where all of these lie. You have degree, harness, surpass, warrant. You have microtech, dual to magnum, and outlook. Mike might talk about Zidua. It's not registered for New York State, so I'm not really spending any time talking to you about Zidua. But these products are taken by seedling shoots and roots, so they have to be applied pre-emergence. They interfere with new plant growth. They're effective against small seed grasses and some small seeded broadleaf weeds. Good control of annual grasses, obviously excellent, in the ratings there. Dual at higher rates is best on Nutsedge, followed by other members of that family, the acetochlors and Outlook. And I think mainly why people choose dual, the solubility is just a little bit less. I think its half-life in the soil is maybe a little bit longer. It just seems to be more effective. So we're going to look at Prowl next. Again, excellent ratings. It's a group 3, a root growth inhibitor. And so you see in that family, here's Prowl, but you also see Treflan. I'm sure Mike's going to talk to you a little bit about that next week. So Prowl is taken up by juvenile roots of seedling plants. So it's soil apply pre-emergence. It's taken up before the plant breaks the soil surface, and it's a contact herbicide. So it's taken up by the roots, but doesn't really go further into the plant. It controls root growth and development. That's how it has its impact. One of the key things about using Prowl is what? Making sure that you get good seed coverage. Because if you apply Prowl and it contacts the seed, you've actually done in that seed. So
Jeff, I just want to give you a quick time check. You've got about 15 minutes left.
All right. Hey, thanks, Janice. Princep is rated good across the board. We already talked about the fact that it's a group 5 photosynthetic inhibitor. So good product to use. Now, the thing to be concerned about is its lower solubility, much lower than atrazine. So really, if you want to be successful with Princep, you should plant and then apply it as soon as you can right after planting. Why? So that any rainfall that occurs between that time and the time when those seedlings, wheat seedlings are germinating, that this product has had enough rain to basically create that layer that those seedlings will have to go through and take it up and have its effects. So again, kind of a summary of these pre-emergence products and grass weed control, annual grass weed control. You have 5 different products, 3 different modes of action. You definitely have ample opportunity to switch from, a group 15, to maybe a group 5 in the second year, to using Prowl, group 3 in the third year. And again, that's just going to help to manage resistance. So perennial grass weed control with pre-emergence application. Our primary perennial grass weeds in our area, yellow nutsedge for sure, quackgrass maybe a far second these days, and then really intermittently wire stem muley and Johnson grass in spots. So yellow nutsedge is the only weed that can be controlled with a pre-emergence application, and that's one of those group 15 herbicides. And I mentioned that dual seems to do a better job, but Harness and Outlook are definitely used as well. So now we move into post-emergence annual grass weed control. Well, guess what? This is a harder thing to do than maybe you imagine, at least with selective herbicides. So I've indicated that Caprino and Steadfast are probably the best of these choices. And you look at the control levels that they give you, and they're still, a hole or two. But then you look at the other options, Accent Q, Impact, Loudus, Resolve Q. They have some impact on some of these grasses, but I'm going to say selective, not really broad spectrum. So post-emergence annual weed control. Steadfast Q is definitely one of the things that's going to be a little bit better. It's a combination of 2 ALS inhibitors, Accent and rimsulfuron, out of Resolve. And Caprino, which is a group 27, which is a bleacher, and a group 2, one of those ALS inhibitors combined. Those 2 products really are the most broad spectrum and effective of that grouping. But one of the things that you got to be really careful about is early application with either one of these. Very important. If you have Roundup Ready corn, you can use Roundup. That's group 9, systemic, broad spectrum. If you have Liberty Link corn, then you can use Liberty, group 10. And just remember, this is a contact herbicide. So again, you have to be careful in timing. It has to be very early to be effective. So perennial grass weed control post-emergence. What I look at as the most predominant things: crackgrass, Johnson grass, wirestem, muley. They definitely can be controlled in corn. Accent group 2 ALS inhibitor can be applied when perennial grasses are 8 inches tall. That's one option. Roundup is the second option, 6 to 8 inch height. Nutsedge, once it's established and growing, you shift over from those group 15s, obviously pre-emergence, to permit. And that can be very effective in controlling nutsedge. So now we're moving into the fact that we spent a lot of time on herbicides, that they are one of those tools in the toolbox. And we talked about best management practices in growing the crop and how helpful that can be to control the weeds just through competition from the crop plant. Now, just start thinking about, you're spending all this money on these herbicides, you probably want to get the most out of them as well. So what is the first thing in optimizing the herbicide use? It's reading the full label. And I know people are groaning right now because, yeah, the labels have gotten huge. But if you look at the actual number of herbicides you purchase and use in a year, it's not going to be 20. It may not even be 10. So that means only a few labels. And yes, you know, the back half of the label where they talk about cotton control and sugar beets and all that, you know, you don't have to worry about that. But you need to read everything, including your particular crop. But reading the label can be really helpful in using all of the best practices possible with that herbicide. So starting with the selection of the appropriate nozzle, the boom height, checking water quality. And this is something that you've heard over and over and over again. I'm just going to ask, have you sent a sample to the lab? Have you found the pH and the hardness test? And have you adjusted to create the water quality that's actually supportive of the herbicides that you're using? I definitely heard of one person that actually collects rainwater and is able to use that predominantly in their mixes for their herbicides. Using the correct rate of herbicide. And, you know, again, you know, I'll probably hear some groans, but if you're doing a soil applied or pre-emergence, many of them have guidance that's related to the soil texture. The finer the texture, the higher the rates. They also talk about organic matter levels. And if you're using medium texture and less than 3% and you're a dairy farmer, then probably you're under applying, because your organic matter is probably more like 4% or 5%. And you should be applying more product to really have the full effect that you want. If you're applying foliar, you know, to the foliage of materials, you should pay really close attention to weed heights, because a lot of times they're going to say, this is the rate for a 3-inch high weed of this type, and it goes up if that weed is now 6 inches. So again, I'm just saying to you, if you really want to make sure that you're getting the best possible weed control, look at those tables. Using the correct rate of water and application. I definitely see the practicality of saying, okay, so I got soil applied materials, they want 20 gallons per acre. I've got foliar applied materials, they want 10 gallons per acre. So let me just shoot right down the middle and get a nozzle that's going to give me 15 gallons per acre. Okay, so I'm just going to say the post-emergence material products that are applied to foliage have a lot of times no soil activity. Okay, so they're applied at lower rates. Why are they applied at lower rates? Because higher rates cause the products to roll off the leaf onto the soil where they have no effect. Why do you want to pay the price for that pesticide and have it roll off the leaf where it has activity onto the soil where it does not have activity? On the opposite side, if you're applying pre-emergence herbicides, your goal is to apply the material in the best pattern possible to get full surface coverage of the soil. So you set up that layer that when that wheat seedling germinates and grows through it, it takes up that herbicide and you have your effectiveness. If you're putting less than the number of gallons that are recommended in the label, you could have spots where you just don't have that material, and what's going to happen in those spots. So, water quantity is kind of a big deal. Using the right adjuvants, right on the label, it's very specific to the product that you're using. You should definitely use what they suggest as far as adjuvants, because why? It enhances the effectiveness of the active ingredient. Applying at the right time. So many post-emergence products have a list of weeds controlled and the height at which that specific weed should be treated. Well, let's face it, you can know that information just so that you have in the back of your head. You're affected by weather, other things that may affect the timing, but knowing when it should be applied gives you the best chance to hit that timing correctly. So we're going to summarize real quick. We have to be aware of herbicide resistance and change our management to avoid it. Using best management practices in crop production to promote crop development to help crops outcompete weeds. That's kind of your number one thing. You're already doing that. Using crop rotation and cover crops to reduce weed populations. Maybe we have to work on the cover crops thing, but right now we have some limited choices based on our normal cropping patterns. Identifying weeds on a field-by-field basis is going to be the key to a successful program. Selecting herbicides that are effective against those weeds in your fields is going to be an important part of the strategy. Rotating herbicide groups and considering multiple herbicide groups as part of a sustained program to counteract herbicide resistance is just an important thing that we should be considering. So that's where I'll end. I will say I'm going to launch a poll, and I'm just going to ask you all if you will take a couple of minutes to select your best answer to the questions. And I'll thank you for answering those questions. I am going to move along to the next slide in the series here. And this is for those folks that have certified crop advisor certifications. And they want to earn credits for today's meeting. If you have that app on your telephone, you can scan this NCR code. And if not, you can take a picture of this slide and you can go to the website and enter the information onto the website. And then for all the other folks that are seeking New York State DEC certification credits, if you'll take the time right now to go back to the chat box and re-enter your name and your certification number. And hopefully everybody that's CCA certified has taken a picture or a scan of that slide. I do want to mention that we have some really good webinars that are coming up in the next few weeks. March 2nd, next Wednesday, from 12 to 1. Mike Hunter is going to be talking to you about weed management in soybeans, and he's done a lot of plot studies, so he's got some really valuable information. March 9th, which is the following Wednesday, Janice Degney is going to talk to you about weed management in hay and pasture. And I know this has been a really popular webinar, so a lot of people signing up for this. And I think it's because we don't really talk about weed management in hay and pasture very often. So definitely happy that Janice is going to be heading that discussion on the 9th. And the final segment of this webinar series is going to be hosted by Lynn Sosnowski. And she's going to talk to you guys about alternative weed control and weed seed management. So I hope that you guys have the time and take advantage of these webinars that are coming up in the future. Each one of them, you'll earn that 1 DEC credit or that 1 CCA credit for. So hopefully that helps you out as well. I will be sending all attendees at today's meeting, I'll be sending you a follow-up page of links of resources. So hopefully you'll find those interesting and helpful as well. So with that, I think we have hit 1 o'clock. I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff, for hosting or for being our presenter today. You did a good job on this.
Thanks, Mike. Mike and Janice, do you have anything to add before we end the meeting?
There was one thing I did want to add, Jeff, maybe some detail about the atrazine versus Princep.
Yep.
I just wanted to remind people that you mentioned it had lower solubility, and you'd have to think about rotation restrictions more so with Princep than atrazine, because it does stay active in the soil longer.
Hey,
So
thanks for that.
Make sure you take into consideration. And then you mentioned Banville in the bud stage. That's going to be definitely included in my presentation. But in corn production, as the corn grows and once it reaches a foot, you have to drop the Banville rate. So it's kind of a conflict there, because you want a little bit higher rate to kill those tough perennials. But if you don't, and they don't really grow early in the season, so that can be challenging timing.
Yeah, good comments.
And then you mentioned about, well, contact herbicides, you have to have good coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if one of the strategies for that is to increase the amount of carrier in the mix. You know, maybe go from 15 to 30 gallons or something. Mike, can you?
Yeah, certainly on contact. Anytime we're into a contact situation, and Jeff and I'll mention it as well, with volume for carrier, if we get into contact herbicides, Liberty, Sharpen, Chromoxone, Paraquat, you're going to want those gallons per acre at 20 gallons per acre would be nice. Droplet size is important as well. So nozzle selection and spray volume is critical with any of our contact herbicides. AIM resource, they'd be another example that Jeff mentioned today, that we're going to have to make sure that we're using the right water volume. The other thing too with some of our contacts is you can, and the label will suggest it too. I mean, you have time of day issues as well. So time of day on some of our contact herbicides with Liberty, kind of in that middle of the day, late morning, before sunset, sometimes a little bit more effective on some contact herbicides as well. But again, as Jeff mentioned, I mean, I know the labels can get boring to read, but read through each label, they're pretty comprehensive, and they're that's the guidance as to how to, most effectively use the product and get the, the best bang for your buck out of there.
Thanks, Mike. That's helpful.
Right, guys. So with that, we'll end today's meeting. I will say for the participants that are DC pesticide applicators that our goal is to get you certificates within 2 weeks. So don't go crazy if you don't see it the first week, but well, our goal is to get the certificates in your hand by email in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
All right,
the
thank you
roster,
very
I mean,
much.
Jeff takes
My
care of the roster. The rosters are gonna go to Albany, so you're gonna get credit maybe before you even get the certificate in the email.
Yeah, correct. The way DEC basically records activities like that, it is the roster, and I'll be sending that out tomorrow. But just look for those certificates in your email, and within 2 weeks, you'll have that.